Chapter 14 American Interlude. In the midst of all the hurly-burly which seemed to be the pattern of my new life, an unworkable constitution, a disgruntled opposition, an embryo office, and a suspicious civil service, I had a most pleasant surprise. I received a letter from the president of Lincoln University informing me that the Board of Trustees had agreed that the Doctor of Laws degree should be conferred upon me at the commencement exercises in June of that year, 1951. It was just over 6 years since I had left America, and I could not believe that such an honor could be bestowed upon me in so short a space of time. I felt that I had not done enough to merit it, and my first inclination was to decline it. I felt also that I was far too busy to pay a visit to America at that time. But my friends were insistent that I should accept the degree and that a trip abroad would do me a lot of good, and so I wrote to the president, Dr. Horace M. Bond, accepting the offer. On the 30th of May, accompanied by Kojo Botsuyo, then Minister of Education, I took off at Accra Airport for London. Thousands had gathered at the airport to bid us bon voyage, and the police had their work cut out, keeping them from following me into the plane. It was my first long flight. Apart from the taking off and landing, which I disliked intensely, I quite enjoyed the trip, but I found it difficult to believe that we would land in London in a matter of 18 or 19 hours, and I spent much of the time musing on the last time I had journeyed from Accra to London. Was it the same Kwame Nkrumah? I wondered. Kojo broke into my reverie to indicate that I should fasten my seatbelt for the last time, I was thankful to note. We circled around London Airport on a clear, bright morning and came into land. The firm tarmac under my feet had never felt so welcome. In the reception hall, a familiar figure walked up towards us, George Padmore. It was a happy reunion, particularly so as it had all happened so suddenly. Together we went to George's flat, where seated around the old kitchen table, we related our activities since our last meeting. Hours later, when each one of us had exhausted his store of information, we sat back and relaxed. It was good to be back in London again, and the change was certainly doing me good. Already the problems and perplexities of the past few months seemed mere trifles. In a gay mood, I made a tour of the Tower of London, Kensington Palace, Buckingham Palace, and St. James's Palace, all buildings I had attacked in my more fiery speeches as monuments of imperialism. 2 days later, we boarded another plane for the United States and arrived early the following morning in New York. It was Kojo's first visit to America, and I was keen to show him all my old haunts. But I had forgotten that this time I was no longer a poverty-stricken student, wandering wherever the mood might dictate, looking for a room and being evicted after a week because I couldn't find the money for rent. What are all these people doing? I muttered to Kojo, as a number of people walked towards us. Kojo replied that they must be extending an official welcome. Sure enough, the protocol officer from the State Department at Washington, followed by a delegation from Lincoln University, headed by the dean and the president and members of the Lincoln Alumni Association, and the liaison officer for Gold Coast students, with a large group of students, were all there to accord me a most enthusiastic welcome. I felt honored indeed. With flashbulbs bursting on all sides, we were ushered into a car and driven to our hotel with a police escort. On arrival at the hotel, I held a press conference. I explained to the reporters that my visit was of a dual purpose, that I was there not only to receive an honorary degree from my old university, but that I was anxious to explore avenues in the United States for obtaining technical assistance for the development of my country. Kojo and I lunched with a Gold Coast businessman on the first day of our arrival, and after this we went on to the apartment of Daniel Chapman, now Secretary to the Cabinet, who was then working in the Division of Non-Self-Governing Territories of the United Nations. There we met a crowd of Gold Coast students and businessmen. We were most enthusiastically received, and everyone was eager for the latest news of the Gold Coast. I told them, as briefly as I could, of the educational and economic development plans that we had in mind, and emphasized to them the importance of their achieving the highest qualifications while they were in America, so that they would later be able to render service to their country as technicians and advisors. It was a very happy gathering, a home from home, not only for Kojo and me, but for all those living temporarily away from our country. I remember Daniel's wife, Efua, handing me a bowl of rice and ground nut stew, from which I ate with utmost appreciation, sitting on a box by the kitchen door. In the evening, various Negro pressmen came for an informal meeting with me, and they were so enthusiastic about my appeal for technical aid and recruitment for the Gold Coast that they promised to give every assistance by way of publicity and propaganda. The following day I travelled to Pennsylvania, where I was met by the mayor and presented with the keys of the city. Philadelphia was a city with many associations for me, both good and bad, and it was a proud moment for me when I was granted its freedom. What would the policeman say now? I chuckled to myself as I thought of my interrupted sleep in Philadelphia's railway station. It was a pity that he would never associate me with that sleepy, down-and-out student, and would be unable to share in the joke. After the ceremony I was taken to the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, where I made a recording for a short broadcast acknowledging the cordial welcome that had been extended to Mr. Bozzio and myself, and assuring the people of America that the Gold Coast was determined to become a democratic state with the assistance of British and American friends. I then went up to my room to wash and prepare myself for a luncheon party that was being given at the hotel by the World Affairs Council and the trustees of Lincoln University. When I got into my room, I looked around for my suitcase. It was not apparent in any of the obvious places, so I searched under the bed, in the cupboards, and in all the most unlikely places. All in vain. I checked with Kojo to see whether it had found its way into his room by mistake, and then got in touch with the hotel porter, but nobody had seen my suitcase. Was I sure I had one? Somebody suggested. I never discovered where it got to, but weeks later it was returned to me in the Gold Coast with everything intact. My friends light-heartedly suggested that my belongings might have been taken for inspection by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but whatever the reason, it was certainly inconvenient at the time. Both Kojo and I spoke at the luncheon. I went to some length to outline the history of my party, the struggle for self-government, and my reason for accepting office under the Kusi Constitution despite my original objections to it. I expressed the hope that in the near future further constitutional progress would be made towards full self-government. I once again stressed the need for American and British technicians to assist in our development program. Many people came to me afterwards and promised to communicate with me concerning this appeal. After lunch, I visited the Philatelic Museum at Temple University, which I thoroughly enjoyed, as I was not only interested in philately, but had a strong passion for museums of any kind. Before we knew we were there, the day had gone. I had to have a few minutes in which to prepare my commencement address for the following day, and so I quietly escaped to my room in the hotel to write this. When I had finished, I gave it to Kojo to read through and give his comments. It was around 10 o'clock when Kojo very sensibly suggested going to bed, for we were both tired, and the following day promised to be as hectic as ever. Kojo, I said suddenly, There are two people I must call and see. This may be the only chance I shall have. One is my old dear landlady, Mrs. Borum, and the other is Portia. Kojo laughed. Do you mind if I come with you? He asked. You don't think I intended on leaving you behind, do you? As I walked to the door of my old lodgings, it felt as if I had never been away. Nothing was changed except that I no longer had the key for the front door. Then I had the awful feeling that perhaps Mrs. Borum might not be there anymore. I had never written to her and she was already an old woman 6 years before. I knocked on the door. We waited a few minutes before we heard the shuffling of tired footsteps in the passage. The door was slowly opened and a sleepy head appeared. She did not recognize me until I asked if I could come in. Then she knew me at once by my voice. It's Kwame, she exclaimed in delight. Kwame, my boy. We embraced. She was my American mother, and it was like a homecoming to both of us. We went in, but I told her that we would not stay long, as it was late and I knew she retired early. After we had chatted about our mutual friends for a while, I got up and said we would have to go. As I was about to leave, I closed her fingers firmly around $100 bill. I can never repay you for all the kindness you showed me in my days of need, but this is a small contribution towards it, I whispered into her ear. Tears were streaming from her eyes as she tried to speak. I gave her an affectionate hug and told her that I would be calling again some day. I knew you would come one day, my boy, she said as we waved her goodbye. It was now midnight or after, and Kojo looked at his watch. Hadn't we better put it off until another time? He inquired anxiously. Not on your life, I said. This is America. It doesn't matter how late you call on people. I found the way to Portia's house and knocked on the door, which was flung open almost immediately. Hello, I said with a broad grin on my face. Portia's eyes nearly popped out of her head and she flung her arms around me in greeting. She had heard I was in town, but my visit at that hour had taken her by surprise. She asked us inside and we sat talking together. Of course, there was another reason for my visit as well as seeing her again, for it was with Portia that I had entrusted my precious books. I kept my eyes off them as long as I thought it polite, but she was quick to sense my feelings, and with a wave of her hand she pointed to the bookcase. Your books, she said casually. You see, I've taken good care of them for you. Whenever you want them, let me know. My books, I exclaimed, trying to look as if I had quite forgotten about them. I lost no time in going to the bookcase, fingering each volume affectionately and remembering the struggle it had been procuring them. Each volume, I recalled, represented a sacrifice of some kind, mostly a meal or a bed for the night. I felt ashamed of myself all of a sudden for showering so much attention on them, while Portia and Kojo quietly sat and looked on. Tell me about yourself, I said to Portia. I discovered that she was married and that her husband did night work. You must have known, she said, with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, calling on people at this hour of the night. Then I suggested that we should all three go out and have a meal at one of the restaurants that Portia and I used to frequent. But this time, I declared, you don't have to bring your purse, Portia. No Dutch treat tonight. Several hours later, tired but happy, a carefree leader of government business and his minister of education threw themselves on their respective beds and were asleep before they had the time to remove their clothes. The following morning, I started on a most memorable day with a formal faculty breakfast at Lincoln University, followed by a morning's discussion with a group of about 30 West African students of the university. At noon, I attended a luncheon given by the trustees of the university and then prepared myself for the commencement exercises at 2 o'clock. Owing to the loss of my suitcase, I found that even though I had bought several shirts, I was short of a clean one that was suitable for such an important occasion in my life. I approached Dr. Bond and explained the predicament that I was in. He at once came to the rescue and lent me a shirt. The whole thing was still like a dream to me. I had been at several commencement exercises at Lincoln during my student days there, but surely the atmosphere was never like this. There was an air of excitement so intense that so intense that I could not believe it came only from me. As I walked in the academic procession in my borrowed shirt, I suddenly felt an imposter. What had I done to merit such an honor? Here was the Kwame Nkrumah of 1935 who had not even enough to pay for one semester at the university, but who had the nerve to persuade the dean to give him a try. And now, 16 years later, that same youth labeled leader of government business was about to have a great honor bestowed upon him by his alma mater. Truly, I mused to myself, it is not the heights to which a man climbs that matter, but the depths from whence he came. The little village schoolteacher with his precious library of free books, the Bible, Shakespeare, and Alcock's grammar. Suddenly, I was jogged out of my daydreaming to find myself in a place of honor on the platform before a large audience among whom were some of my own tutors, my colleagues, and my old classmates. The dean, Professor Hill, was addressing them on what I had done to merit the award. He concluded his speech by saying, "I remember when Mr. Nkrumah applied for admission to this university, he quoted in his letter from Tennyson's In Memoriam, 'So much to do, so little done.' I would like to conclude by saying that I feel, as far as he is concerned, this should now read, 'So much achieved in so short a time.'" The President, Dr. Bond, then conferred upon me the degree of Doctor of Laws and I was invited to speak. I began by outlining briefly my student days in America and later in London, explaining my political activities in London, such as the organization of the West African National Secretariat, the editing of the New African, and the subsequent abandonment of my studies there in response to an invitation from the Gold Coast to become General Secretary to the United Gold Coast Convention. I went on to relate the difficulties I encountered in organizing the UGCC, my arrest and detention in the Northern Territories, the split with the UGCC and the formation of my own party, the Convention People's Party, with its motto of "We prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility," and its policy of "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all things shall be added unto you." This met with enthusiastic cheering from the audience. I then explained how the CPP had organized the masses in their fight against British imperialism, how, because of general dissatisfaction with the Kusi constitution, I had resorted to positive action in an effort to coerce the British government into granting a greater measure of self-government, and how, as a result of this, I and many others had been arrested and imprisoned on charges of sedition. I spoke of the recent general election and my party's great victory, my release from prison and my decision to accept office in spite of the bogus and fraudulent constitution, because I felt that with time and patience this could be amended and in due course we would obtain full dominion status within the Commonwealth. I explained that we felt no bitterness against Britain, that we stood for no racialism, but that we would not tolerate imperialism in any form. I then spoke about my hopes for the future. We are aiming to work under democratic principles such as those that exist in Britain and in the United States. What we want is the right to govern ourselves, or even to misgovern ourselves. I again spoke of the needs of the Gold Coast for technicians, machinery, and capital to develop its great natural resources, and explained that I was appealing to the democracies of Britain and the United States for this assistance in the first place, but that if this should not be forthcoming, I would be forced to turn elsewhere. I said that there was much for the Negro people of America to do to help their ancestral country both then and in the future, and then upon the attainment of independence. It was the intention of my party to rename the country Ghana. I concluded my speech by referring to the Doctor of Laws degree that had just been conferred upon me. This honor, I said, is not so much a tribute to the little work that I have done, but to the people of the Gold Coast and Africa, who by their deep sense of responsibility and self-respect have made my work possible. I carry home with me a lively memory of this historic occasion. The commencement exercises finished up with a tea party which was held in the grounds of Dr. Bond's residence. In response to my appeal, many Negro graduates approached me and expressed a desire to go to the Gold Coast and do their bit, and I asked them to write to me when I returned to my country. I explained to them that we were handicapped at the present time by our position as a colonial territory, but that as soon as we had achieved independence, we would be able to extend a hand of welcome to all those who desired to come to our country to do work. I then returned to New York, where on the following day I paid official calls on Sir Gladwin Jebb, the British delegate to the United Nations, and on the mayor of New York. Just before midday, I held a press conference. My speech the previous day had aroused much interest, and I was bombarded with questions about how much the Gold Coast needed in dollars to help with its development, what would be the conditions of service for interested technicians, and other pertinent matters arising from my address. I quite enjoyed this and managed to fire back my replies as quickly as the questions were asked. This was followed by a television talk in which both Kojo and I took part. After lunching at the United Nations headquarters, I attended the meeting of the Trusteeship Council, which was then under the chairmanship of Sir Alan Burns, a former governor of the Gold Coast. He had already left the Gold Coast before I began my agitation, but he had naturally heard all about it, and we found quite a lot to talk about. Later, I had talks with Mr. Trygve Lie, Dr. Ralph Bunch, and Mr. Wilfred Benson, and other officials concerned with the possibilities of assistance in the planning of the Volta River scheme, scholarships for Gold Coast students, and technical assistance generally. These talks were most encouraging. The next day, Kojo and I traveled by train to Washington, where we were welcomed by 4 officers from the Department of State. Our stay there was brief, but the program was full. I had talks with the officers of the Department of State and other government departments, and learned how the organization of the United States government worked, laid a wreath on the memorial to Abraham Lincoln, visited the Jefferson Memorial, and attended 2 receptions, one at the British Embassy and the other immediately afterwards at the State Department. The following day, I returned to New York and prepared for my departure. In the evening, the mayor of New York arranged a large dinner party in honor of Kojo and myself. All the leading Negro dignitaries and officials were present, and I gave a speech on the political development of the Gold Coast and on our hope to become self-governing in the near future. I expressed a desire that all those who wished to return to help develop the country would be most welcome after independence, when we would be free to open our arms to whomsoever we pleased. I said how very happy I had been that I was able to pay this unexpected visit to the United States, and how welcome everyone had made me feel. I would carry back with me many happy memories. As I sat down in my place, my thoughts went back to the day when I delivered my last sermon in America at the Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. My text was, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth." I reminded the people of how history repeated itself. Just as in the days of the Egyptians, so today God had ordained that certain among the African race should journey westwards to equip themselves with knowledge and experience for the day when they would be called upon to return to their motherland, and to use the learning they had acquired to help improve the lot of their brethren. I impressed upon the people that they should not be despondent or impatient, for their turn would come any day now. Be prepared, I warned them, so that you are ready when the call comes, for that time is near at hand. I had not realized at the time that I would contribute so much towards the fulfillment of this prophecy. On the 10th of June, Kojo and I waved goodbye to a crowd of officials, students, and other well-wishers who had assembled at the airport to send us on our way. We both felt happy in our hearts and encouraged by the talks we had managed to have, but we were completely exhausted. Did we sleep at all in America? I yawned. There was no reply from my companion, for he was already asleep with his safety belt fastened securely around his waist. We were a few hours late arriving in London, but in spite of this, George Padmore and a few African students were there waiting for us. I had the good fortune during this short visit to meet Mr. Attlee and most of the leading members of the British Labour Party, and I stressed to them the urgency of granting full self-government to the Gold Coast. Whilst I admitted that it was important not to act too hastily, I urged them to do all they could to speed it up. I was invited to a reception by Mr. Lennox Boyd, a Conservative MP. He made me feel extremely welcome and showed keen interest in all that I told him about affairs in the Gold Coast. Little did I know then that this same man would, 5 years later as Secretary of State for the Colonies, serve as the connecting link between my government and that of the United Kingdom for the negotiations concerning independence. Another house where I was invited and where I was made to feel very much at home was that of Lord and Lady Mountbatten of Burma. With their knowledge of India and the transfer of power there, we found much to discuss of mutual interest. It was fortunate, too, that Sir Charles Arden Clarke was on leave from the Gold Coast at that time, and I was able to have valuable discussions with him, together with the Secretary of State for Colonies and other colonial office officials. I paid a visit to the House of Commons, where I dined with two of the members and listened to part of an all-night debate that was going on at the time. I got through a lot in a short space of time, and it was really something of a relief when I boarded the Boac plane at London Airport. As the four engines came to life, and we waited at the end of the runway to take off, I counted on my fingers the stops we should make. Tripoli, Kano, Lagos, Accra. What had been happening in Accra while I had been away, I wondered. It seemed so long since I left. I was just a little bit anxious. The following morning, when the plane touched down at Kano to refuel, I was greeted at the airport by a delegation of the Kano branch of the CPP and other political supporters in Nigeria, and I was presented by them with a ceremonial sword that had been made locally. A few hours later, as we circled over Accra before landing, I observed that the whole of the airport area seemed to have been changed from grey tarmac to dark brown and black. People, thousands of them cheering themselves hoarse. That was all the proof I needed to show that all was well. Whatever else might be in store for me, the people, those that really mattered, were solidly behind me and my party. As soon as I poked my head out of the plane door and walked down the steps, the crowds broke through the barriers, and in one frenzied charge, they swarmed around me. In a matter of seconds, I was whisked off my feet and carried shoulder high amidst yells of greeting, party songs, and cries of congratulations to Dr. Nkrumah. What a joyous ending to so memorable a trip. Later in the day, I arranged to speak to the people at the Arusu Memorial Park in order to greet them after my return from America. I was dressed, for the first and last time, in an army tunic. When I arrived, the crowds were so dense that it was almost impossible to penetrate them. It took us over an hour to push our way, inch by inch, to the platform because the people were so tightly jammed together that, try as they might, they could not press closer together to make a passageway for me. They were panting and groaning as their bodies were crushed against one another, and everywhere I looked I could see people fainting. When I eventually reached the platform, I realized that it was useless trying to address them and told them to assemble the following Sunday at the arena. I stood in silence as I gazed down at that thickest of gatherings, a great body of human beings that neither pain nor discomfort could distract from their purpose, proof in its most concrete form of their solidarity, and I was deeply moved at the thought that it was I who had the honor of leading them.